Well, thank you very much. I think maybe the most constructive thing that I could add to the conversation maybe is to recount just briefly the reason that organizations like the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, the Minnesota Nursery Landscape Association, or the Agri-Growth Council, why we're so concerned about immigration reform. And our view comes entirely from our desire not only to have the state's economy evolve and change, but also to grow. Our analysis is that unless the economy is changing, it's not going to grow. Anybody who just wants to think about economic growth, has been in a cave for the last 20 years. So we're interested in change, and a big part of the change is the nature of the workforce. But actually, it goes further than that. So when we think about immigrants or new Americans and their role in the economy, we tend to think about four contributions. First, as workers. Second, as entrepreneurs. Third, as customers. And then finally, as a way of kind of bringing, in our case, Minnesota closer to the world economy and better able to be a successful competitor in a world economy. So, and the fact that sort of between those four contributions and a changing and evolving economy is this obstacle called the U.S. immigration system that gets our attention and has made this a very important issue for the Minnesota business community. And maybe just to put it in perspective, I've worked for the State Chamber of Commerce for 20 years. Our focus as a trade association has almost exclusively been on the Minnesota legislature and the state's executive agencies. We typically leave local issues to the local Chamber of Commerce and federal issues to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So in those 20 years, we have actually worked on two federal issues. We did some work on health care reform, and then the second issue is immigration reform, where we've been active and working on that for about 7 or 8 years now. Just to give you an idea of how important we as a state association see the issue, and I think to some extent our frustration with the inability of I don't care, the Congress, the U.S. Chamber, pick the trade association, their inability to make any progress on this issue. Let me just maybe elaborate a little bit on the four contributions, because I think I think as you visit with policymakers, I think we spend too much time talking about just workers, and those are important, and I'll give you some examples, but the other three contributions are just as significant, and I think if we elevated those ideas, it might help to move the policymakers to action. So first is workers. The State Chamber has an economic development program called Grow Minnesota. Last year through that program, we saw one-on-one about 1,000 companies. Of those 1,000 companies, about 2/3 of them said they were actually looking to hire workers. They were on the job market and looking for workers all across the spectrum. What's interesting about that is that 1/3 of the companies looking couldn't fill the positions that they had open in a timely fashion or couldn't fill them at all. So we've got Minnesota companies already. Kathy mentioned the demographics and the fact that we've got more folks retiring. We're just at the beginning of that, and we're already struggling to fill jobs. Secondly, of the companies that we visited, a significant number were actually planning to expand their operations in Minnesota, or actually expand their operations. And of those expanding, 80% said they would grow in the state. Of those that were thinking about expanding outside of Minnesota, when you ask them why, there are two reasons that come up with the greatest frequency. The first is one that you would expect, and that is we got a big customer in Chicago, so we need to build a facility there. So it's a market-driven decision. I like to ask audiences, at least business audience, what they think the second question might be, or policymakers. So what do you think the second most common reason is they give us for saying they're going to expand outside of Minnesota? Remember, I'm with the Chamber of Commerce. So what do you think they say? No, they don't say taxes. Workforce. It turns out that Minnesota companies have a very low tolerance for not being able to find the people they need when they have an opportunity to grow. And so we see companies looking outside of Minnesota to fill those, to put a facility elsewhere in order to be able to fill their positions and get the work done and serve their customers well. I don't want you to think they don't care about taxes. They all do. They all want them lower. But when they're in an expansion mode, they're trying to figure out how to take advantage of an opportunity to grow their business and to do it successfully. So, and then finally, in terms of workers, I visit a lot of businesses statewide, and my experience the last year, when I walk around a manufacturing facility or an office, a financial services company, that workforce is so much more diverse than anybody would think. To even conclude for a nanosecond that the immigrant worker is only a herdsman at a Davisco dairy in St. Peter is just not true. I was at a medical device company in Chaska a few weeks ago. That workforce is almost entirely Latino, Hmong, and Somali. I visited a manufacturer of automated packaging equipment in the Twin Cities, and that business is actually growing mostly because of new customers in Mexico and South and Central America, and his workforce has looking specifically for folks who are fluent in Spanish, and you walk through his plant and you see a large number of Latinos. So these workers are all over the spectrum of skill levels and occupations and industries. Second, as entrepreneurs, just the Partnership for a New American Economy points out that 40% of the Fortune 500 companies are either started by new Americans or their children. But just if you look at Minnesota, 2 weeks ago I was at a meeting on how to build export activity in our state. It's a key to the development of the economy, to get more sales outside of Minnesota. We had the meeting at a company that develops software to manage power plants and the flow of electricity over the transmission system. It's called OATI. Its founder is from Southeast Asia. And then we went from there. Again, we're talking about exporting. This wasn't about immigrant. It just so happens that that's where the meeting was. And then we went and toured a Minneapolis company that's big on exporting in North Minneapolis. That was founded by an Israeli about 20, 30 years ago, Accent Sign Systems. So entrepreneurship is a big deal in the state's economy. And then third, customers, like it or not, and I don't think people recognize this, is that new Americans pretty quickly pick up our habits of being conspicuous consumers. They like to shop, and that's a big deal in this state's economy. And then, finally, as this world economy grows, the fact that we have more, the presence of immigrants and new Americans in key roles in our various Minnesota businesses makes it a whole lot easier for us to do business with folks from elsewhere in the world. When they come to Minnesota and see the diversity of our workforce, that makes, whether they're from Asia or Africa or from South America, more comfortable and feeling more positive about being able to do business in a state that is known, you know, mostly for Andersons, Larsons, and, you know, and then Germans, actually. So that's the fourth contribution. So I think, Tamar, when you make the point that, you know, the Midwest may be different, I'm not sure that it is or it isn't, but I can tell you from our experience, the role of new Americans in the development and growth of the state's economy is really critical, and we hope that kind of telling that whole story to the policymakers will get them to advance the ball on immigration reform, even if it's incremental. And maybe later I'll talk a little bit about that. I think the incremental approach has a lot of merit, and I frankly would do that. John.
Good morning, everybody. My name is John Keller. I'm the Executive Director of the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. And Kathy, how long? 5 minutes. Let me just summarize my thoughts in 5 minutes. So first and foremost, many thanks to the partners that helped to bring today's meeting about.